The safest place in your world can be the most dangerous. They believed the threat would come with a weapon, not from the hands that cooked their food and mixed their medicine. The mistake was small, trusting what felt routine, swallowing without thinking twice. By the time the fevers started, it looked like nature. But something far more deliberate was already inside the room.
The air inside the master bedroom is thick, stagnant, and smells faintly of rotting fruit. It is the height of summer in the Mississippi Delta, 1848. In a massive four-poster bed, dwarfed by fine linens and mosquito netting, the most powerful man in the county is dying. He is sweating through his sheets. His skin is a pale, translucent yellow. For days, his stomach has been gripped by violent, tearing cramps. His heart flutters erratically, like a trapped bird. Standing over him is the local white physician. The doctor has done everything his prestigious medical training demands. He has bled the plantation owner twice, draining pints of dark blood into a brass bowl to balance his humors. He has forced him to swallow heavy doses of calomel, a compound made of mercury chloride, which has only succeeded in making the dying man's gums bleed and his teeth loosen in his skull. Nothing has worked. The white doctor has quietly informed the family that the master's organs are failing. It is only a matter of hours. But the dying man suddenly grips the bed frame. He shakes his head. He refuses the white doctor's next dose. With whatever breath he has left, the master begs his family to leave the room and send for someone else. He asks for a man he owns. He asks for an enslaved field hand who lives in a dirt floor cabin at the edge of the property, a man the white community refers to in hushed, nervous tones as a root doctor. The family is horrified. It goes against the very laws of nature and society they have built. But the master insists. Within the hour, the enslaved man is brought into the grand bedroom. He does not carry a medical bag. He carries a small pouch of dried leaves, tree bark, and roots pulled from the Mississippi swamps. He doesn't bleed the master. He doesn't poison him with mercury. He boils water, brews a dark, bitter tea, and holds the cup to his owner's trembling lips. Within a day, the fever breaks. Within a week, the master is walking the grounds again. To a modern observer, this reads like a triumph of alternative medicine. But look closer at the scene. Look at the power dynamic in that room. The man in chains held the life of his absolute oppressor in his hands. He possessed knowledge the white establishment did not. He had the power to heal. And if you understand anything about the mechanics of biology, you know the terrifying truth that hung silently in the humid air of that plantation. The exact same knowledge required to cure a man can be used to quietly, perfectly, and untraceably kill him. The master knew it. The doctor knew it. The state of Mississippi knew it. This is not a story about a miraculous healer. It is the story of a clandestine war. It is the story of how an entire society built on absolute dominance realized with sudden and suffocating terror that they were entirely at the mercy of the people they brutalized. It is a true crime story where the weapon wasn't a gun or a knife, but a leaf. And the investigation into this crime exposes a systemic paranoia so deep it forced an empire to put nature itself on trial. To understand why this crime matters, why the legal and psychological shockwaves of this era still echo in our institutions today, you have to understand the illusion of control. We are taught to view the antebellum South through a lens of total, crushing white authority, the overseer with the whip, the bloodhounds, the slave patrols, the legal codes that reduced human beings to chattel. It was an environment designed to project absolute invulnerability. But an institution that requires total control is inherently fragile. It requires the oppressor to believe that the oppressed are less than human, unintelligent, incapable of complex thought, and easily managed. But biology doesn't care about the laws of men. Disease doesn't respect a property line. In the 1840s, the Mississippi Delta was one of the deadliest places on Earth. It was a frontier of brutal capitalism, rapidly cleared for cotton. But the swamps fought back. Malaria, yellow fever, cholera, and dysentery swept through the plantations in devastating waves. The white medical establishment was shockingly primitive. This was the era of heroic medicine, a polite term for practices that essentially tortured patients. Doctors believed illness was caused by overstimulation of the blood and nerves. Their solution was to violently purge the body. They used leeches. They sliced veins open. They administered toxic heavy metals to induce vomiting and diarrhea. In an era before germ theory, calling a white doctor to your bedside was statistically more likely to kill you than the disease itself. Contrast this with the medical reality in the enslaved quarters.
Stolen from West Africa, or born to those who were, enslaved people had brought with them generations of profound botanical knowledge. They encountered a North American landscape filled with new plants, but they quickly mapped the native flora, blending indigenous American knowledge with their own traditions. They knew that willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in modern aspirin, could break a fever. They knew that snake root could induce a sweat to clear toxins. They used poultices of clay and herbs to prevent infection in wounds. They practiced empirical, observational science. They were healers because they had to be. The plantation owners certainly weren't going to pay for expensive medical care for their workforce unless it was a last resort. So, enslaved communities relied on their own doctors, men and women who understood the deep, quiet language of the woods. Slowly, inevitably, a shift occurred. White overseers and plantation owners noticed that the enslaved populations were surviving fevers that were putting white families in the ground. And when desperation hit, white masters began crossing the color line. They started secretly requesting the services of enslaved healers. The healer at the center of this narrative, a man whose identity is obscured in the fragmented court records of the time, often referred to simply as the doctor or the conjurer, was one such man. He had built a reputation that transcended the boundaries of his bondage. He was permitted to travel between neighboring plantations to treat the sick. He walked through the front doors of grand mansions. He commanded an unspoken, terrifying respect. But respect, in a system built on racial subjugation, is highly radioactive. It quickly decays into fear. By 1848, the reliance on enslaved healers had created a psychological crisis for the white elite. The entire justification for slavery rested on the myth of white intellectual superiority. Yet, here were white masters ignoring their own educated physicians, begging illiterate enslaved men to save their lives. It was an unbearable cognitive dissonance. And then, the deaths began. It started quietly. A brutal overseer on a neighboring property developed a sudden agonizing stomach ailment. The local white physician diagnosed it as gastric fever. The overseer lingered for a week, wasting away before dying in agony. A month later, a plantation owner who had recently ordered the separation of 3 enslaved families fell violently ill after his evening meal. He complained of an unquenchable thirst. His pupils dilated until his eyes looked like black glass. He fell into a delirium, fighting invisible demons in his bedroom, before his heart simply stopped. The coroner wrote it off as a sudden apoplexy. Then a master's wife. Then an appraiser who specialized in valuing human property for auction. People were dropping dead, healthy, wealthy, powerful people. The symptoms were always slightly different, but the timing was always impeccable. The deaths almost always followed acts of extreme cruelty or removed individuals who posed severe threats to the enslaved community. This is where the criminal investigation begins. But it wasn't an investigation led by forensics. It was an investigation led by panic. The white authorities faced a massive investigative blind spot.
In 1848, forensic toxicology essentially did not exist in the American South. There were no blood tests. There was no way to swab a teacup and test for alkaloids. If a person died of a mysterious internal ailment, a doctor had to rely entirely on the visual symptoms. But the symptoms of poisoning, vomiting, cramps, dehydration, fever, heart failure were identical to the symptoms of the natural diseases ravaging the Delta: cholera morbus, dysentery, malaria. The perfect murder weapon is one that mimics the environment. But as the body count rose, the white planters couldn't ignore the whispers. The enslaved community was entirely too quiet. There was no mourning for these dead masters. Instead, there was a subtle, invisible realignment of power. Overseers became slightly less eager to use the whip. Masters thought twice before denying food rations. A chilling realization began to dawn on the white establishment. They were being hunted, and they were being hunted in their own homes by the people cooking their food, pouring their water, and mixing their medicine. The focus of the authorities immediately turned to the healer. He was the obvious suspect. He had the mobility, he had the knowledge. Most importantly, he had the motive. But the authorities lacked a fundamental understanding of how the crime was being committed. They were looking for a traditional conspiracy, a group of men plotting in the woods with stolen firearms. What they failed to understand was that the healer didn't need a gun. The woods were his armory. The mechanics of this clandestine war were deeply rooted in botany. The American South is home to some of the most toxic plants on the continent. The healer knew them all.
He knew about Datura stramonium, commonly called Jimson weed. Just a few crushed seeds slipped into a bowl of soup would cause profound hallucinations, a racing heart, and eventual respiratory failure. The white doctors would call it a brain fever. He knew about Ricinus communis, the castor bean plant. While castor oil was a common remedy, the healer knew that if you crushed the fibrous mash left over from the beans, you extracted ricin, one of the most lethal natural poisons on Earth. A dose the size of a grain of sand baked into a piece of bread would cause a slow, agonizing death over several days as the victim's internal organs shut down. The white doctors would call it cholera. He knew about foxglove, which contains digitalis. In small doses, it regulated a heartbeat. In a concentrated dose, it stopped the heart completely. The healer wasn't just a doctor. He was an assassin operating with military precision. He didn't kill indiscriminately. If he killed every white person he encountered, the military would have been called in to burn the quarters to the ground. Instead, he engaged in targeted, strategic strikes. He removed the most immediate threats. He maintained a baseline of terror that forced the oppressor to negotiate their cruelty. He weaponized the very system that enslaved him. The white masters believed they owned everything, the land, the plants, the people, but they were deeply alienated from the land. They didn't know how to read the forest floor. They relied entirely on enslaved labor to harvest their food and prepare their meals. Their absolute dominance was the exact mechanism of their total vulnerability. When the local sheriff and a posse of armed planters finally came for the healer, they didn't have a warrant and they didn't have proof. They operated on the terrifying assumption that he must be stopped, not for a crime they could prove, but for the capacity he held. They dragged him from his cabin in the middle of the night. They tore his living quarters apart, looking for the smoking gun. What they found only deepened their confusion and terror. They found small leather pouches containing dried roots, powdered leaves, animal bones, and strange twisted pieces of wood. To the white authorities, this looked like trash. Some of the more superstitious men in the posse called it voodoo or conjure magic. This was their ultimate systemic weakness. Racism fundamentally breaks an investigation. Because the white authorities believed the enslaved man was intellectually inferior, they couldn't process the fact that they were looking at a highly sophisticated pharmaceutical laboratory. They wanted to believe it was demonic magic, because admitting it was chemistry meant the healer was a scientist. It meant admitting he had outsmarted them. They threw him in a heavily guarded jail cell. The illegal apparatus of Mississippi was entirely unprepared for this kind of defendant. Under the law, an enslaved person was classified as chattel personal, property. A horse or a plow cannot be charged with premeditated murder. To put the healer on trial for a complex, calculated string of assassinations required the state to implicitly acknowledge his humanity, his intellect, and his agency. The trial was a grotesque theater. The official narrative presented to the court was clear. A malicious, crazed slave had used devilish magic and crude poisons to murder upstanding citizens. The prosecution brought in white doctors who confidently testified that the victims had died of unnatural causes, despite having no toxicological evidence to back the claim. But beneath the official story lay the uncomfortable reality. The white masters sitting in the gallery weren't watching the trial with righteous anger. They were watching it with profound, quiet dread, because deep down they knew the truth. They knew that if the healer was guilty, then the myth of their invincibility was shattered. They knew that every time they sat down to dinner, every time they took a sip of water, their lives were entirely dependent on the forced goodwill of the people they kept in chains. They tortured the healer, demanding a confession. They wanted him to name his accomplices. They wanted to expose the entire network. He gave them nothing. He refused to give them the comfort of fear. He sat in the courtroom, his posture unbroken, watching the men who claimed to own him sweat in their high-collared shirts. He knew that whether he lived or died, he had already won the psychological war. He had proven that the master was not a god. The master was just a man with a stomach, a heart, and a fragile nervous system. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The healer was found guilty of poisoning and sentenced to death. But the state didn't just want to kill him. They needed to destroy his myth. They needed to reestablish the illusion of control. They arranged for a highly public execution. They brought enslaved people from miles around and forced them to watch as a warning.
They hanged him until he was dead, and then they left his body to the elements. A brutal message to anyone who dared to challenge the natural order of white supremacy. The local newspaper published a small, triumphant article declaring the menace had been eradicated. The streets were safe. The natural order had been restored. But you cannot hang knowledge. You cannot lynch an idea. In the immediate aftermath of the healer's death, the paranoia of the white establishment did not subside. It mutated. It became codified into law. Across Mississippi, and soon across the entire American South, legislatures quietly began passing a series of astonishing, deeply telling laws. It became a capital offense, punishable by death, for an enslaved person to prepare or administer any medicine to a white person. It became a severe crime for an enslaved person to be found in possession of poisonous weeds or unknown roots. It was illegal for them to practice as doctors or physicians. Think about the profound irony of those laws. The lawmakers of the antebellum South, men who built their political careers arguing that black people were biologically inferior and incapable of complex intellectual tasks, were legally admitting that enslaved people were sophisticated chemists, brilliant botanists, and highly capable physicians. The laws were a public confession of fear. They were an admission that the white elite had completely lost control of the hidden environment around them.
The official history books often relegate these laws to footnotes, framing them as minor regulations regarding slave conduct. But when viewed through the lens of human behavior and criminal psychology, these laws are a massive, neon sign pointing to a terrifying reality. The oppressor was terrified of the oppressed. When we zoom out and look at this case, not just as an isolated incident in 1848 Mississippi, but as a study of power and human nature, it reveals a devastating truth about how institutions fail. We tend to measure power by the visible apparatus of control: who holds the gavel, who wears the badge, who signs the checks, who carries the weapon. The plantation owners had all of these. They had the law, the economy, and the physical force entirely on their side. But true power is not always loud. True power is often invisible. It is the monopoly on vital knowledge. The healer understood that the system's greatest blind spot was its own arrogance. The planters were so convinced of their superiority that they never bothered to learn the landscape they claimed to own. They never bothered to study the plants growing a few yards from their grand verandas. They outsourced their survival to the people they enslaved. This case exposes the fatal flaw in any system built on absolute subjugation. You can command a person's labor, you can command their physical location, but you can never command their internal reality. You cannot control what a person observes, what they deduce, and what they secretly learn. The healer did not act out of blind, chaotic rage. His actions, and the actions of countless unnamed root doctors and enslaved healers like him, were an extreme form of logical resistance. When the legal system offers no justice, when the political system offers no voice, and when the social system actively seeks to destroy you, justice does not simply disappear. It goes underground. It becomes asymmetric. It takes the form of a crushed seed in a bowl of broth. The legacy of the healer is not just a story of a brilliant man pushed to extreme measures. It is a mirror held up to the architecture of systemic vulnerability. The white establishment thought they had built an impenetrable fortress, but a fortress is only as secure as the people who open the gates, cook the food, and draw the water. They killed the healer, but the deaths didn't stop. They just became quieter, harder to track. The fear he planted in the minds of the master class took root and grew into a permanent psychological rot. The plantation owner would forever sit at the head of his long mahogany table, surrounded by fine silver and crystal, and look down at the meal prepared for him by someone he owned. He would raise the fork to his mouth. He would swallow. And in that quiet, solitary moment, the grand illusion of the master's power would shatter. He knew he was playing Russian roulette with his own biology. Because trust requires equality. It requires a mutual respect for humanity. When you strip that away, when you force a person into chains, strip them of their name, and demand they serve you, you are no longer a master being served. You are a hostage taking a blind leap of faith. You lift the bitter tea to your lips. You look at the steady, unblinking eyes of the man who poured it. The cup touches your teeth. And you have to ask yourself, exactly what did you just swallow?